Parallelism. What is parallelism? Parallelism is a poetic device where two or more clauses have a corresponding meaning. There are two major types of parallelism. Of course, there are more, but the two major types are synonymous parallelism, where two or more clauses have similar ideas, and the second major type is called antithetical parallelism, where two or more clauses have opposite ideas. To think of an easy way to remember these, the word synonymous comes from the word synonym, which means similar. Like this word has a synonym, so similar ideas. Antithetical comes from the word antithesis. Think of the word anti, which means opposite. So synonymous parallelism is a poetic device where two or more clauses have the same meaning expressed in different words. So you have the same meaning in two clauses, but one clause has different words from the other clause. Antithetical parallelism, on the other hand, two or more clauses express opposite ideas. So these are the two definitions for the two types of parallelism we will look at today. Think of parallel lines. In math, parallel lines are two lines. They run in the same direction, but they never meet. So think of synonymous parallelism in the same way. You have two clauses expressing the same ideas, but not with the same words. And with antithetical parallelism, you also have the two lines, but they're opposite ideas. So again, they don't meet. So here's our first example. It's as dark a tale as was ever told of the lust for treasure and the love of gold. Here we have two terms that are similar. Lust and love. They both have the idea of desire. Then treasure and gold. Gold is a treasure and treasure has gold. So lust for treasure is the first line. It's the first clause, the main idea, and that idea is expressed in different words in the second line. So love of gold. So lust for treasure and love of gold have the same idea, but they're expressed in different words. Same idea, different words. That's an example of synonymous parallelism. So think of the two lines. They never meet. The words are not the same, but they run in the same direction. Same ideas, different words. Synonymous parallelism. Example number 2. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. This selection from A Tale of Two Cities is full of antithetical parallelism. If we look here, red expresses one idea, and blue expresses the opposite idea. So it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. In the next clause, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. So opposite ideas, wisdom, foolishness. Same deal with the next clause. Epoch of belief, epoch of incredulity. So belief against lack of belief. Season of light, season of darkness. So light versus darkness, opposite ideas. Spring of hope, winter of despair. Spring is the best time of the year. Winter, it's the most challenging time of year. Weather's bad. Can't go out, there's no green. So spring, hope. And the opposite, winter, despair. Totally different ideas, opposites. This whole selection is full of antithetical parallelism. It can be even set up this way for clear analysis. So each two lines, as I have them set up here, express an antithetical parallelism. One idea followed by the opposite idea. So it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. Genius. Example number 3. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters. This is from Psalm 24, 1 through 2. The first couple of lines have an example of synonymous parallelism. So here you have the term earth and also everything in it. Then the next line, world and all who live in it. So earth and world express the same idea in different words. Everything in it and all who live in it, they express the same idea as well, but in different words. That is an example of synonymous parallelism. In the bottom two lines as well, there's another example of parallelism. Founded it on the seas. Founded it means he began it, he set it up. So founded it and on the seas. Following line established it. Same idea as founded it, but different words. And instead of on the seas, on the waters. Same idea, different words. So there are two examples of synonymous parallelism in just these two verses in the Psalms. Now, why do we use parallelism? What is its functions? There are several. Number one, it clarifies ideas. Part of the way humans learn is by repetition. When you repeat the same ideas, but in different words, this helps people make clear what they're listening to. It helps them clarify and understand what they're being told or what they're being taught. Same thing with expressing opposites. When people express opposites, they make each idea clear. How? By defining what it's not. So this is what it is, this is what it's not. This is what it is, this is the opposite. That also leads to solidification of ideas. So not only do we get the ideas clearly, but we also solidify our understanding. We become very strong and skilled and clear in what we are being told. So clarification and solidification. Also for beauty. So if you noticed, some of those examples had a very beautiful feeling to them. They made things clear. And again, it is a poetic device, so it's used a lot in poetry. Poetry is beautiful language. Also cleverness. By expressing the same idea in two different ways, that's a bit clever. It shows that the person using the parallelism clearly understands what he's talking about or what she's talking about to the point of being able to say the same thing using two different ways of using words. And also memorization. Again, this goes back to the learning part. Part of the way humans learn is by repetition. Every single skill that we have learned to do well, we repeated it, whether it was tying our shoes, using a pencil, driving a car, it's all by repetition. So repetition in the sense of parallelism, when we get one idea and that same idea is expressed in different words, or we get one idea and the opposite comes right after it, that helps us to memorize those concepts that are being expressed in the parallelism. Now, how do we use synonymous parallelism? We should try to use this in our writing, especially if we like poetry and creative writing. Number one, we have to think of an idea we want to express. Then, we write it down. After that, we think of another way of saying the same thing. So think of the same idea but using different words. Then use those different words to express the same idea. That is how you can use synonymous parallelism. How about antithetical parallelism? Well, again, we think of an idea we want to express and write it down. Then think of an opposite idea, especially one that will make the first idea very clear. For example, if we want to talk about the day and the night, we can say during the day, we wake up, we play, we work. During the night, we go to sleep, and the people that are awake may commit crimes. That, not all the time it happens, but it's so opposite it makes the first idea clear that the day is good. That's how antithetical parallelism works. So then we would write down that opposite idea that we just expressed. Here's another example. Better is a dinner of vegetables where love is than a fatted ox and hatred with it. And that comes from Proverbs 15:17. Dinner of vegetables and love are two terms in the first line. Notice that's a very simple dinner. Not everyone thinks of dinner, oh wow, we're going to eat vegetables today. No, we think more of a main course, some beef or chicken or turkey or whatever. But here he's talking about a dinner of vegetables, but that dinner has love in it. There is love among the people on the table eating that dinner. The next line talks about a fatted ox and hatred with it. Now, in the past, when the Proverbs were written almost 3,000 years ago, people were farmers. When they had a very big feast, they would take a cow, slaughter it, cook it, they would have a great meal of beef. And that was considered, if you were rich, that happened often. But if you were not that rich, that happened very rarely throughout the year. So here it's saying, if you're thinking of that big dinner with the beef that everybody wants, that happens so rarely, but it has hatred with it, then better is the dinner of vegetables where love is. So again, it's putting that first idea out and coming up with an opposite idea that's making it clear that it doesn't matter what you're eating. What matters is how the people at that table view you and value you. So if they love you, it's better to eat anything with them, even vegetables. But if they hate you, even that fatted ox, it's not going to be a great dinner for you. Trivia. Parallelism is extremely ancient. As you saw, there are two examples from biblical poetry, from the Psalms and the Proverbs. Parallelism is actually the main poetic structure of biblical poetry. It was the preferred system among the Hebrews for their poetry, just like how we have meter and rhyme in English. Meter and rhyme are our preferred systems for poetry in English. Parallelism was the preferred system for biblical poetry. Also, it's saying the same thing using different words if it's synonymous. Or it's showing how two things are different. Example number 5. Some people live to eat, while others eat to live. Here, we have an example of antithetical parallelism. Live to eat is the first idea, so somebody that's all they do in life. They're gluttons, all they live for is food. But others, they eat just to live. They eat just for the purpose of surviving. So one, their purpose in life is eating. The other, their purpose in life is surviving. Now, this is a special type of parallelism called chiasmus. If you notice, the terms live to eat and eat to live, it's really inverted. So if you change the order of the words, live to eat, it becomes eat to live. If you do it backwards. That is called chiasmus. It's a special type of antithetical parallelism. You can learn more about it by clicking on the link in the description below or clicking on it in the end screen of this video. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Metaphor. What is a metaphor? A metaphor is a figure of speech which refers to one object by the words or phrases that describe another object. It is a figure of speech in which two things are made to be the same. That's why the words and phrases that describe one object describe the other as well. You may have heard it defined like this before. A metaphor is a comparison without using like or as. Get rid of that definition right now because it's wrong. Why? Short story. If you follow this definition, then you will identify certain similes, some types of similes, as metaphors. For more information on that, you can click the link in the description below or at the end of this video, and it'll take you on the video on similes, and you can learn more about them there. But this is the definition that you need to keep in mind. A metaphor is a figure of speech which refers to one object by the words or phrases that describe another object, because one object's really being turned into the other one. Here's an example. Great rose bushes of red bloomed on Victor's cheeks. So the idea here is that Victor is blushing, but it is not describing it as blushing. It is describing it as great rose bushes of red. That's describing the blushing. One object is being described by the words and phrases that describe the other object. And the blooming is describing how fast he turned red. When people blush, it starts slowly. You don't turn red in a second, it takes several seconds. So here, that process of blushing is being described by the words that describe flowers. So another object, blooming. So just like a flower blooms slowly. It starts off as a bulb, then becomes the actual flower. Here, that description is given to the act of blushing. So the blushing, that's one object, is being described by the words and phrases of the other object, which is blooming. That's how metaphors work. And when you think about it this way, there's really an idea that the one object, which is the blushing, is being turned into flowers. Of course, it's not literal because this is figurative language. Another example. All our words are but crumbs that fall down from the feast of the mind. So here, words are described as crumbs. One object, words, is described by the words that describe another object, crumbs. So the little drops that come from bread. And the mind's thinking is being described as a feast. So being described using different words than what normally apply. And again, the idea is the words and thinking are being turned into a feast with a lot of crumbs coming down from the table. Now, why do people use metaphors? What is their function? Well, there are several. We're going to discuss the four main types here. The first and primary way why people use metaphors is to beautify a way of speaking or writing. It gives beauty to a word. It gives beauty to speaking. It gives beauty to writing. That's why poetry uses metaphors. This is the primary function of metaphors. But then there comes another way. Usually, it can be used as a comparison. Not so much as similes, for example, but it can highlight a comparison. But it's to help people think in different ways. So, for example, if I'm talking about the mind and thinking, and the words that come out of the mind, because words are the results of our thinking, then I start thinking about these processes in a different way. Oh, it's like a feast. It's like crumbs. I look at it in a different way. So it's for creativity as well. Third way is to help people understand a concept, and that concept's usually difficult, so an idea that's usually difficult by a comparison. Again, for metaphors, not so much as, for example, similes. Similes help people understand much better than metaphors, but metaphors can also function in this way. And the last main way, so again, these are four main ways, there are others, these are the primary functions, is to provoke an emotional response. So if I say, for example, that blushing, I'm turning it into flowers blooming, that is a positive emotional response. It creates positive feelings because flowers are positive. They're given by people to the people they love. They are good to smell. They are pleasant to look at. So, oh, he's blushing, but it's so nice. He's blushing because he likes the girl. And this is really nice. That's positive. But if I, for example, turn his blushing into blood dripping all over his face, that creates a negative emotional response. So you can use metaphors to also create a sense of emotion in your hearers or readers that can create positivity or negativity. And this makes metaphors very powerful. Because that way you're able to get people to not only think in a different way, but if you want them to think in a positive way or a negative way, you can do that as well. So these are the four most common functions of metaphor. So how do we identify metaphors? Well, it's a step-by-step process, and it works by questioning. So we have to ask ourselves 3 questions when we're reading a text to be able to identify a metaphor, or even if we're listening to a speech. Number 1. Is there a comparison being made between 2 objects? So if the answer to this question is yes, we go on to a second question. But if it's no, then you're not really going to have a metaphor. Because a metaphor is a type of comparison. It's not really a comparison, but you can think of it that way. So if the answer is yes here, now you have to move on to a second question. So is one object being turned into another object? Or is one object being described with the words that describe another object? If the answer here is yes, you have a metaphor. But you can't stop here. There's one more question. So if there is an object being turned into another object, is that object being described as a person or being turned into a person? If the answer here is yes, Now you have a different figure of speech, which is called personification. It's a type of metaphor, but it's a very specific type. You can't simply call it a metaphor anymore. So if the questions 1 and 2 have the answer yes, you have a metaphor. If all 3 of them are yes, you have personification. And if 1 is no, then most likely there's not going to be a 2. But in case you ask 2 first, you'll be alright. But if 2 is no, then you don't have a metaphor. So 1 and 2 have to be yes in order for it to be a metaphor. If 3 is answered yes, then now you have personification. So let's look at another example. It says, hard light bathed them, a whole nation of eyeless men. Let's ask ourselves the question. Question 1. Is there a comparison here between 2 objects? Well, yes, it says a hard light bathed them. Bathed here describes something besides light. There is a comparison. You can ask question number 2 first. Is one object being turned into another? And yes, if hard light is bathing people, that nation of eyeless men, then hard light is being described as water. It's being turned into water. So that is a metaphor. Let's try with another example. Go down the questions. It says, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. So again, question 1, is there a comparison here between 2 objects? And the answer is yes. There is a comparison between the world and a stage. And by extension, the men and women and actors. Players here is an older way of saying actors in English. So the answer is yes to number 1. Let's go to number 2. Is the world being turned into a stage? And the answer is yes. It says the world's apostrophe S means is. So all the world is a stage. So it's being turned into a stage. And by extension, the men and women are being turned into actors. We go to question number 3. Is the world being turned into a person? The answer is no. Then you say, well, wait a second, the men and women are being turned into persons. Well, yes, but they're already persons. So it's not personification. This is a metaphor. So the world's being turned into a stage. The men and women are being turned into actors. The entrances are being turned into births. And the exits are being turned into deaths. Because how do we enter and exit the world? Through birth and death. So this is a big metaphor right here. Trivia. Well, what's the word metaphor? Where does it come from, and why does it apply to this figure of speech? It's a Greek word, which means to carry over or to transfer. And this is because a metaphor transfers the words and phrases that describe one object to another object. So the description and phrases of one object are transferred onto the other object. They're carried over onto the other object. So that's metaphor. We see it here. I dream a world where love will bless the earth. Love is being turned into a person who is blessing. So the description of a person who is blessing, the verb bless, is being carried over. It's being transferred to love. Now, this type of metaphor is personification. Because if you remember, question number 3 says, is the one object, which in this case here is love, is it being turned into a person? Well, yes. The verb bless is something that only people do. So love is being turned into a person who is blessing. This here is an example of personification as well, which is a very specific type of metaphor. If you are interested in more, you can click here to go to other videos and topics that are related to metaphors. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Anaphora. What is anaphora? Anaphora is the repetition of a word or sequence of words at the beginning of clauses. Think about it this way. It is the repetition of a word or sequence of words at the beginning of each sentence or phrase. For example, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. The repetitive phrase or sequence of words is it was the. You can see it here colored blue for convenience. It's repeated at the beginning of every phrase, this sequence of words. Another example. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. In this case, this is set out as a poem, and it makes it much easier to recognize the anaphora, because it is at the beginning of every line, and that repeated sequence of words is I have, and you could see it there. Now, the process for identifying anaphora has several steps. First, you look for a repetitive word or set of words. Then you have to make sure it is at the beginning of the clause, or at the beginning of a sentence, or for ease, right after a comma. Because if a word repeats, or a set of words repeats, it does not automatically mean it's anaphora. There are several other forms of repetition. Anaphora is the repetition at the beginning of the clause, which is the beginning of a sentence or right after a comma. And after you've done that, pick out each instance that word or set of words is repeated in the same exact way over and over again. And then you have identified the anaphora. What are the functions of anaphora? Why do writers and people who give speeches use this? Number one, it creates an emotional appeal. You keep hearing the same words, and especially if you're trying to move somebody to action and keep using the same words that are trying to get people to move to action, that creates emotional appeal. But it also strengthens arguments. If you are arguing about some type of conclusion, and you keep repeating the conclusion, and every time you're giving different evidence, it makes the argument much more powerful. It delivers it straight to home with the listener or the reader. So you can see that it has quite a variety of functions, from artistic to very intentional, logical argumentation. It also creates a rhythm to help in remembering. So it's also used quite a bit in poetry, because the repetitive part of it, and as you saw in the poem, helps the reader remember. It also emphasizes some points. So in the poem, if you go back here, it's talking about the experiences of the speaker. They have done this, and they have done that, and they have done this also, and that, and so on. The person is experienced, and Frost here is delivering that point to home. So another example. Let's follow the first step. Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? So step one, we look for a repetitive sequence of words at the beginning of each sentence. And here, because it is a poem, it's clear. Where is the repeated sequence of words? Another example. This one's not poetry. So now we have to read it and look for the repetitive phrase and make sure it's coming at the beginning of each sentence or right after a comma. What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. And this comes from speech, Robert F. Kennedy delivering news of Martin Luther King's death. The repetitive phrase is what we need in the United States is not. And it repeats 3 times. Notice it's not all throughout the speech or the sequence of it, but 3 times. It doesn't have to be all throughout, but it has to repeat enough times. So, twice, 3 times, 1 time, of course, it's not repeated. 3 times is a good way to identify an aphora. Also, if it's repeated 2 times, mentioned 2 times, that's also an aphora. So it's used 3 times, and it's at the beginning of each sentence, each clause. So it is an aphora. Trivia. Well, the word anaphora is a Greek word, which means to carry back. Because the repeated word is brought back, is carried back to the beginning of the following clauses or sentences. The use of anaphora in literature is very ancient. It is clear in the Bible. Here's an example from the Bible. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. The repeated sequence of words here, or word, in the anaphora is I. You're probably thinking, wait a second. That's not what I identified as the repetition. I identified as a child. Well, that's right. A child is also repeated, but it is not an aphora. It is a repetition, but it's not an aphora. Why? Because it's coming at the end of the clause, and that is called epistrophe. Epistrophe is the opposite of anaphora. It's a repeated sequence of words that comes at the end of a clause or sentence, or right before a comma. If you want more information on epistrophe, you can click the link below in the description, or at the end of this video there will be a link to that as well. Now, if you use anaphora and epistrophe in the same sentences, it's called simplicy, and that's also another type of rhetorical device. So all 3 are rhetorical devices. If you are interested, there are videos on each, plus other types of repetition. Thanks for watching.
In linguistics, a hyponym is a word or phrase whose semantic field is included within that of another word, its hyperonym, a hyponym. In simpler terms, a hyponym shares a type of relationship with its hyponym. For example, pigeon, crow, eagle and seagull are all hyponyms of bird, which, in turn, is a hyponym of animal. Hyponyms and hyponyms. Hyponymy shows the relationship between a generic term and a specific instance of it. A hyponym is a word or phrase whose semantic field is more specific than its hyponym. The semantic field of a hyponym, also known as the superordinate, is broader than that of a hyponym. An approach to the relationship between hyponyms and hyponyms is to view a hyponym as consisting of hyponyms. This, however, becomes more difficult with abstract words such as imagine, understand and knowledge. While hyponyms are typically used to refer to nouns, it can also be used on other parts of speech. Like nouns, hyponyms in verbs are words that refer to a broad category of actions. For example, verbs such as stare, gaze, view and peer can also be considered hyponyms of the verb look. Hyponyms and hyponyms are asymmetric. Hyponymy can be tested by substituting X and Y in the sentence. X is a kind of Y and determining if it makes sense. For example, a screwdriver is a kind of tool makes sense, but not a tool is a kind of screwdriver. Strictly speaking, the meaning relation between hyponyms and hyponyms applies to lexical items of the same word class, and holds between senses rather than words. For instance, the word screwdriver used in the previous example refers to the tool for turning a screw, and not to the drink made with vodka and orange juice. Hyponymy is a transitive relation. If X is a hyponym of Y, and Y is a hyponym of Z, then X is a hyponym of Z. For example, violet is a hyponym of purple and purple is a hyponym of color. Therefore, violet is a hyponym of color. In addition, it should be noted that a word can be both a hyponym and a hyponym. For example, purple is a hyponym of color but itself is a hyponym of the broad spectrum of shades of purple between the range of crimson and violet. The hierarchical structure of semantic fields can be mostly seen in hyponymy. They could be observed from top to bottom, where the higher level is more general and the lower level is more specific. For example, living things will be the highest level, followed by plants and animals, and the lowest level may comprise dog, cat and wolf. Under the relations of hyponymy and incompatibility, taxonomic hierarchical structures too can be formed. It consists of two relations, the first one being exemplified in an X is a Y, while the second relation is an X is a kind type of Y. The second relation is said to be more discriminating and can be classified more specifically under the concept of taxonomy. Co-hyponyms. If the hyponym Z consists of hyponyms X and Y are identified as co-hyponyms. Co-hyponyms are labeled as such when separate hyponyms share the same hyponym but are not hyponyms of one another, unless they happen to be synonymous. For example, screwdriver, scissors, knife, hammer are all co-hyponyms of tool, but not hyponyms of one another. That hammer is a knife does not make sense. Co-hyponyms are often but not always related to one another by the relation of incompatibility. For example, apple, peach and plum are co-hyponyms of fruit. However, an apple is not a peach, which is also not a plum. Thus, they are incompatible. Nevertheless, co-hyponyms are not necessarily incompatible in all senses. A queen and mother are both hyponyms of woman, but there is nothing preventing the queen from being a mother. This shows that compatibility may be relevant. Usage. Computer science often terms this relationship an as-a relationship. For example, the phrase red is a color can be used to describe the hyponymic relationship between red and color. Hyponymy is the most frequently encoded relation among synsets used in lexical databases such as WordNet. These semantic relations can also be used to compare semantic similarity by judging the distance between two synsets and to analyze anaphora, as a hyponym can be understood as a more general word than its hyponym. The relation is used in semantic compression by generalization to reduce the level of specialization. The notion of hyponymy is particularly relevant to language translation, as hyponyms are very common across languages. For example, in Japanese the word for older brother is ani, and the word for younger brother is ototo. An English to Japanese translator presented with a phrase containing the English word brother would have to choose which Japanese word equivalent to use. This would be difficult, because abstract information is often not available during machine translation.
Please get your popcorn and chainsaws. It's time for Phoneme.
Welcome, avid learner of linguistics. This video is going to deal with word formation processes, focusing on the general patterns that we use when we create snazzy new words. Let's hit it then, chaps. Before we really start, we want to make clear what we're talking about when talking about word formation. So let us say that the outcome of a word formation process is a new lexeme. And in the process we may use morphemes or rather lexemes that exist already. Now, who came up with the word lexeme and what does it mean? The answer to the former part is a bunch of strange people who like to call themselves linguists. The answer to the latter part is that a lexeme is like a standard shape of a word, which you can find in every good dictionary or, more generally, in the lexicon of a language. Got it? Lexicon? Language? Makes sense, doesn't it? These are two examples for lexemes, the words to chunder and bolt. And as this video is about word formation, let's see what happens if we throw these two together. We can form a new word, chunderbolt. This process of putting two lexemes together is a way of forming compounds. Let us now draw a tree, because no video is perfect and meaningful without a tree. We can differentiate two directions of word formation. The first one I've just mentioned a few seconds ago, compounding, where you put two elements together and see what comes out. The other big process is derivation, which I'd like to subdivide into affixation and non-affixation. Affixation, as the name might suggest, means adding an affix, like a prefix, suffix, infix, interfix, circumfix, transfix, or whatever you prefer fix. Non-affixation, on the other hand, is the umbrella term for processes such as conversion, where you basically change the word class of a lexeme without changing its outside appearance. The words address and address would be an example for conversion. Back formations are words like self-destruct and to edit, which come from self-destruction and editor. Blending is when you mix words together, like lion and tiger, which make up the word liger. And clipping is when you play psycho killer and slice words like bread, shortening perambulator into the word pram. You might just ask now, what about inflection, if you know what that is? Well, inflection does not produce new lexemes, so it's not a word formation process. But along with word formation, it is a morphological process. You can also remember that the differentiation between inflection and derivation might become important because you need them for the morpheme analysis of a lexeme. You can learn more about that by clicking on the orange button in the bottom right corner. Now let me point out the difference between inflection and derivation. First of all, if you stumble upon the term lexical, it refers to derivation, whereas grammatical refers to inflection. Derivation is a process which forms new lexemes. Inflection's job is to transform such lexemes into their respective word forms to make them fit into a sentence pattern. An example for derivation is adding the suffix full to the lexeme respect, resulting in the word respectful. If you add the prefix dis, you get disrespectful. An example for inflection is the conjugation of the verb to go into went, or even adding the third person s, forming goes. You probably recognize that this example of derivation changed the word class of our original lexeme. It has changed from a noun into an adjective. Such things cannot occur with inflection, as it merely produces the word forms of a lexeme, and these are all fixed. And now, what you should know about inflection in English. The English language has no more than 9 inflectional endings. These are the plural s, the third person s, the genitive s, the comparative ending the superlative ending est, the progressive ing, the simple past morpheme, which here stands for all irregular forms as well, the past participle morpheme, and the adverbial li. Remember that these are morphemes, so they all have different allomorphs as well. And finally, what we can use for derivation, and that would be all sorts of affixes like d, in, un, able, less, full, ing, which in this case forms gerunds, and combining forms like tele, photo, ology, graph, as well as any other existing lexeme. This should suffice for now. Let all that beautiful information sink in for a moment. And now, order your Pikachu to use Chunderbolt. like a sir. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Welcome, avid learner of linguistics. This video is going to feature this wicked pragmatics thingy that people call implicature. Off we go. And as usual, we should start out with defining what we want to talk about. An implicature is an utterance which conveys meaning beyond its proposition. And there we have yet another word we have no clue about. A proposition refers to the semantic content of a sentence. Anyway, whenever we use an implicature, it's like we can draw a conclusion from what is said and therefore deduce more meaning than is actually encoded. Pretty neat, isn't it? Now, Paul Grice, the father, or should I say grandfather of pragmatics, subdivides implicature into two types, conversational and conventional. Conversational implicatures are special in that they employ the cooperative principle and the maxims of conversation. If you don't know what that is, there's a green button below. So logically, if conversational implicatures have to do with the cooperative principle, conventional implicatures do not. They actually try to make a point about a contrast, and very often you can be tipped off by words like but or yet. However, many people wouldn't go for a classification into conventional implicatures simply because, if we're honest, you can find maxims of conversation everywhere. Which is why I'm going to leave out these rudimental implicatures further on. On the next level we can subdivide as well. Specifically, conversational implicature can be subdivided into three types. The first one is the generalized conversational implicature. Generalized means it doesn't depend that much on the context. Even by definite articles or tenses, you can implicate certain things, like in the following sentence. The arsonist put a house on fire. If you don't know what an arsonist is, pause the video and look that up now. Done? Okay. So, this sentence features a generalized implicature simply by using the article a. The implication behind it is simply that it is not his own house the arsonist is burning down. It could be any house really, but not his. The next type is the particular conversational implicature, which this time strongly depends on the context to implicate correctly. Look at this dialogue. Do you want to go to the cinema tonight? My little sister's coming for a visit. On the surface, B's reply doesn't seem to be a relevant answer to A's question, which is why B just violated a maxim. However, what B wanted to implicate is that she wouldn't have time to go to the cinema because she's busy with performing shaman rituals with her sister, or so. So to use and point out the implicature, B flouts the maxim of relevance. Now why is this an example for a particular implicature? Well, simply because we wouldn't have a clue what B's utterance is about if we didn't have A's question. The last type is called scalar implicature. Whenever we use a word that expresses a degree, you automatically implicate that the thing you're talking about isn't of any higher degree. So here you have a scale going from none to all. And now have a look at the sentence. I had some buttered scones for tea. The word some is in the middle of our scale, meaning that you just had some, but not all buttered scones, because they're really high in fat and you really wouldn't want to eat them all. So this was it. For a final test, try to identify the implicatures in the following example. If you liked this video, or my amiable voice, or even both, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Bye!
Diaxis and Reference, a presentation by Luis Fernando Castañeda, Jessica Megan Fullerton, and Lois Torres Brown. I will be presenting what constitutes the group effort regarding the script and the presentation design and the examples that have been contributions by all three members of the group. The concepts that will be covered through this presentation are: what is diaxis, types and examples of diaxis; what is reference, types and examples of references; and works cited. Diaxis is the pointing or the specifying function of some words. It is originally a Greek word, and It is the pointing, as we said, or the specification of the function of those words, whether they are definite articles or demonstrative pronouns. And their denotation will change depending on the discourse. So there are 4 labels or categories among deixis. They're time, place, person, and discourse. There are several types of deixis. The first one is person deixis, which is a personal pronoun that encodes the roles of the participant when the speaker is referring to themselves, to the addressee, or to other people. In this case, if they're referring to themselves, it would be I, me, we, and us, or the addressee would be you, and other people would be he, him, or she, her, it, they, and them. Some examples of this would be, for example, he tried to hurt me, but they came to the rescue, or would you like to have an ice cream cone? The second type of deixis is place deixis, which is the indication of the spatial location of people and the objects relative or referring to the participant in the speech event that is taking place. In this case, we look at the speaker's purposes, which can be to identify entities with demonstrative pronouns, this and that and those and these, or perhaps to inform about the location of an entity, for example, using adverbs such as here and there, which indicate proximal and distal objects, or prepositions like above and below. Finally, the last speaker's purpose could be to acknowledge a location of an entity. Some examples are he was sitting over there, or we love living here. The third type of deixis is time deixis, which is locating time or the points or intervals on the time axis, using the moment of the utterance as a reference point. In this case, all participants are sharing the same dialectic time origin, which means they have the same noun, and time is relative to the act of speaking. The dialectic elements that can be identified are time adverbials, for example, before, yesterday, last year, before the utterance, today, now, soon, tomorrow. And tenses, for example, past simple in Rachel baked the cake, or Rachel had baked a cake when the doorbell rang, in which case had baked would be the past perfect, and when the doorbell rang would be the time reference. The moment of the event precedes the time reference, which precedes the moment of the utterance, and the moment of the event and the time reference are non-dialectic, but the moment of the utterance and the time reference are dialectic. Some examples could be, did you call at 9 p.m. last night? I was out then. You should have been here yesterday. The fourth type of deixis is the discourse deixis. Now, the use of dialectic expressions to reference a portion of a discourse relative to the speaker's current location in the discourse refer to this type of deixis. Some of the examples for these expressions could be on the last page in the final paragraph, or at this point, we're going to return to the previous chapter. I bet you haven't seen this movie, and that's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. Now, moving on to the second topic, we will be defining reference. Now, reference is a part of semantics, which aims to provide an explanation of how different words can express meaning. A word suggests an idea to the hearer, and then this idea is connected to a real-world object or an object in the real world. And this is a way that speakers denote meaning as a property of linguistic expression. Now, there are different types of references. The first one is definite, and this constitutes the act of identifying entities through different linguistic expressions, through their properties. For example, the florist delivered flowers to her. In this case, the noun phrase can be identified by both the speaker and the listener, even without complete information about the target that is being referenced. Distinguishing elements for a definite type of reference are definite determiners, the, our, pronouns like I and she, names, proper names, locative adverbs here and there, and adverbs temporal like now or yesterday. Now, another type of reference would be the indefinite one, and it is the one in which the success of the act of reference doesn't depend on the individual features, only on the class. For example, a florist delivered flowers to her. Now, the particular florist that is involved in the act is unknown, and it is irrelevant for the speaker and the hearer whether or not they can identify the reference target. It could be any random florist. The distinguishing elements of this type of reference are indefinite determiners, indefinite pronouns, locative adverbs such as anywhere, and adverbs temporal like sometime. The third type of reference would be the generic reference. And these are the nouns that don't pick out a particular entity but address a general class. So, for example, the airplane is a safe mode of transportation. An airplane is a safe mode of transportation. Airplanes are a safe mode of transportation, which are statements about the general class. In this case, what we mean to say is that an airplane is a reliable mean of transportation. And this would be the bibliography for our work. On behalf of all the members of my group, of Luis Fernando and Megan, I would like to say thank you for taking the time to listen to us and to go through our presentation. And thank you for the opportunity, for the learning opportunity on this activity. So thank you for watching.
Welcome, avid learner of linguistics. If you are able to read, and I'm sure you are, you can read here. This video is about metonymy, that weird bugger. Well then, let's take it away. As every cool and fancy word in linguistics, the word metonymy comes from the Greek language, and it means something like the other name, loosely translated. It basically means that you call one thing by another thing. You might just say that it is like a metaphor, but no, I wouldn't go that far. Unlike metaphor, there is a real connection between the concepts used in metonymy. We have two concepts, concept A and B, which are like literally, no, rather figuratively tied together, hence the chain. The conclusion is that when one concept moves, the other one follows. Might be a little confusing yet, so here are the examples. We can speak of metonymy when an effect represents its cause. That is, we mean the cause but speak about the effect, 'cause we're cool. And of course, cool people smoke. Logically, we have our own cool word for the stuff that we smoke, because cigarettes are just plain vanilla. As linguists and nicotine addicts, we talk about cancer sticks. And this is metonymy. Think of it. If you smoke too many cigarettes, what's going to happen with your lungs? It'll be just tarred as a highway if you're lucky. But the more likely thing to happen is you'll get lung cancer. So the consequence of smoking is cancer, which is why calling a cigarette a cancer stick is metonymy. Now here's an example for the other way round, where the cause names the effect. There is a word called fortune, which for ordinary people is synonymous to wealth and money today. And why is this? Well, let's try using logic here. So, focus. If you have a great fortune, you must have been quite lucky or fortunate. And if you're a poor devil without any fortune, you probably were less fortunate. So, the cause of being wealthy is having luck. That's why fortune employs metonymy as well. Oh, need I mention that chain-smoking linguists don't know what a great fortune is? Go figure. Here are some other metonymy patterns. You can use an object to call its usage, which works perfectly well with body parts, because if you hand something in, what are you using for that? Or would you rather use your eye or your belly button to eye something? Also, shouldering might have to do something with using one's shoulders. You can also name an object by its material. What about the word iron, or its converted form to iron? You know, these things were originally made of iron. Men might be a little bit puzzled right now. That's because they think that the washing machine puts the crease into their doublets and knickerbockers. I do too. So for men who are able to read, here's the word paper, which can be a test paper or a newspaper. However, that doesn't change the fact that you call it by the material it is made of. Here are some other things with metonymy. A part can name the whole. A container can name its content. The originator can name a product, which then is called eponymy. A leader can name the party, or a location can name what's there. As a final thought, I bestow upon thee this final question. Why is the White House a metonym? So that was it. Thank you for watching. I hope I could illuminate the topic a little. If yes, please subscribe. If not, do subscribe anyway. Toodles! Welcome, avid learner of linguistics. In this video you're going to learn about the conceptual metaphor and what it can do for you. So, let's get cracking. First of all, we should ask ourselves where we can find a metaphor, just to have something nice at hand. And the key answer that is and always will be correct is in poetry. So, why not take a glimpse at this bloke's Sonnet 18? Let's start reading. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Hold it, there we have it already. A metaphor. Why should we compare someone to a summer's day? Well, simply because we have no idea what said person looks like. The idea of a summer's day, however, gives us a clue of what the person is not. A freezing cold blizzard beast with icicles for boobies. We think of a summer's day that it's warm and nice, everyone likes it and it's pretty. So this is what this person is like. Now, let's come to the grey matter part. The word metaphor comes from Greek metaphero, which means to carry over or transfer. The idea is actually pretty simple. In a metaphor we have two domains that we employ in the transfer of meaning. The source domain, from which we draw a concept, and the target domain, of which we actually have no clue what it actually is, and into which the concept from the source domain is being transferred. Let me give you an example. Time. What is time? You see, we don't really know what time is, but somehow we want to talk about it. As you see here on the target domain, there isn't a picture of time, because you simply can't find one. But what if I present to you our source domain, money? We all have a pretty clear idea of how money works. You can spend it, you can win it, steal it, earn it, save it, lose it, and so on. And this is where metaphor kicks in. We can get a nice picture of time by resorting to the concept of money. When thinking that time is money, we can say, we can spend time, steal time, save time, waste time, and so on. Do you see it? This is our metaphor. Time is money. And it works so well because time and money are analogous systems. That means they both react in similar ways. This is a feature of metaphors called systematicity. Another feature of metaphors is abstraction, which means that the two concepts employed in a metaphor behave similarly but have no real connection. Their connection is an abstract one. The third feature is asymmetry, which means that the transfer works only from the concrete concept to the abstract concept and not the other way around. The process of metaphor is always directed from the source to the target domain. Now you know how metaphors work. So why don't you have a look at this? The famous metaphor from the film Forrest Gump. Life is like a box of chocolates. And if you have some spare time left, you can think about the philosophical question of how metaphor actually shapes and by some degree restricts our perception and our way of thinking. Now that we are done with metaphor, why don't we talk about metaphor's best friend, metonymy? If you want to know what metonymy is, click the What the Heck is Metonymy button. See you!